Thomas Jefferson was an American founding father who was the principal author of the Declaration of Independence, and later served as the third President of the United States from 1801 to 1809. Prior thereto, he was elected the second Vice President of the United States, serving under John Adams from 1797 to 1801. A proponent of democracy, republicanism, and individual rights, motivating American colonists to break from Great Britain and form a new nation. He produced formative documents and decisions at both the state and national level. Jefferson was primarily of English ancestry. Born and educated in colonial Virginia, he graduated from the College of William and Mary and briefly practiced law, at times defending slaves seeking their freedom. During the American Revolution, he represented Virginia in the Continental Congress that adopted the Declaration, drafted the law for religious freedom as a Virginia legislator, and served as a wartime governor. He became the United States Minister to France in May 1785, and subsequently the nation's first Secretary of State in 1790. 1793 under President George Washington. Jefferson and James Madison organized the Democratic-Republican Party to oppose the Federalist Party during the formation of the first party system. With Madison, he anonymously wrote the controversial Kentucky and Virginia resolutions in 1798, 1799, which sought to embolden states' rights in opposition to the national government by nullifying the Alien and Sedition Acts. As president, Jefferson pursued the nation's shipping and trade interests against Barbary pirates and aggressive British trade policies. He also organized the Louisiana Purchase, almost doubling the country's territory. As a result of peace negotiations with France, his administration reduced military forces. He was re-elected in 1804. Jefferson's second term was beset with difficulties at home, including the trial of former Vice President Aaron Burr. American foreign trade was diminished when Jefferson implemented the Embargo Act of 1807, responding to British threats to U.S. shipping. In 1803, Jefferson began a controversial process of Indian tribe removal to the newly organized Louisiana Territory, and he signed the act prohibiting importation of slaves in 1807. Jefferson mastered many disciplines, which ranged from surveying and mathematics to horticulture and mechanics. He was a proven architect in the classical tradition. Jefferson's keen interest in religion and philosophy earned him the presidency of the American Philosophical Society. He shunned organized religion, but was influenced by both Christianity and deism. He was well-versed in linguistics and spoke several languages. He founded the University of Virginia after retiring from public office. He was a prolific letter writer and corresponded with many prominent and important people throughout his adult life. His only full-length book is Notes on the State of Virginia, considered the most important American book published before 1800. Jefferson owned several plantations, which were worked by hundreds of slaves. Most historians now believe that, after the death of his wife in 1782, he had a relationship with his slave Sally Hemings and fathered at least one of her children. Historians have lauded Jefferson's public life, noting his primary authorship of the Declaration of Independence during the Revolutionary War, his advocacy of religious freedom and tolerance in Virginia, and the Louisiana Purchase while he was president. Various modern scholars are more critical of Jefferson's private life, pointing out the discrepancy between his ownership of slaves and his liberal political principles. For example, presidential scholars, however, consistently rank Jefferson among the greatest presidents. Early life and career. Thomas Jefferson was born on April 13, 1743, at the family home in Shadwell in the colony of Virginia, the third of 10 children. Education. Jefferson began his childhood education beside the Randolph children with tutors at Tuckahoe. Jefferson entered the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia, at age 16 and studied mathematics, metaphysics, and philosophy under Professor William Small. Small introduced him to the British empiricists including John Locke, Francis Bacon, and Isaac Newton. Jefferson improved his French and Greek and his skill at the violin. He graduated 2 years after starting in 1762. He read the law under Professor George Wythe's tutelage to obtain his law license. While working as a law clerk in Wythe's office, Jefferson treasured his books. In 1770, his Shadwell home was destroyed by fire, including a library of 200 volumes inherited from his father, lawyer and House of Burgesses. Jefferson was admitted to the Virginia bar in 1767 and then lived with his mother at Shadwell. Jefferson took 7 cases for freedom-seeking slaves. The British Parliament passed the Intolerable Acts in 1774, and Jefferson wrote a resolution calling for a day of fasting and prayer in protest, as well as a boycott of all British goods. His resolution was later expanded into a summary view of the rights of British America, in which he argued that people have the right to govern themselves. Monticello, marriage and family. In 1768, Jefferson began constructing his primary residence, Monticello, Italian for Little Mountain, on a hilltop overlooking his 5,000-acre plantation. He moved into the South Pavilion in 1770, turning Monticello into a neoclassical masterpiece in the Palladian style was his perennial project. On January 1, 1772, Jefferson married his third cousin, Martha Wales Skelton, the 23-year-old widow of Bathurst Skelton, and she moved into the South Pavilion. Martha's father, John Wales, died in 1773, and the couple inherited 135 slaves, 11,000 acres, and the estate's debts. The debts took Jefferson years to satisfy, contributing to his financial problems. Martha later suffered from ill health, including diabetes, and frequent childbirth further weakened her. Her mother had died young, and Martha lived with 2 stepmothers as a girl. A few months after the birth of her last child, she died on September 6, 1782 at the age of 33 with Jefferson at her bedside. Shortly before her death, Martha made Jefferson promise never to marry again, telling him that she could not bear to have another mother raise her children. After working as Secretary of State, he returned to Monticello and initiated a remodeling based on the architectural concepts which he had acquired in Europe. The work continued throughout most of his presidency, being finished in 1809. Political career 1775 to 1800. Declaration of Independence. Jefferson was the primary author of the Declaration of Independence. At age 33, he was one of the youngest delegates to the Second Continental Congress beginning in 1775 at the outbreak of the American Revolutionary War, where a formal declaration of independence from Britain was overwhelmingly favored. He sought out John Adams, an emerging leader of the Congress. Jefferson consulted with other committee members over the next 17 days, and drew on his own proposed draft of the Virginia Constitution, George Mason's draft of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, and other sources. The Declaration was introduced on Friday, June 28, and Congress began debate over its contents on Monday, July 1. Virginia State Legislator and Governor. At the start of the Revolution, Jefferson was a colonel and was named commander of the Albemarle County Militia on September 26, 1775. In 1778, Jefferson was given the task of revising the state's laws. He drafted 126 bills in 3 years, including laws to streamline the judicial system, Jefferson's proposed statutes provided for general education, which he considered the basis of Republican government. Jefferson was elected governor for one-year terms in 1779 and 1780. During General Benedict Arnold's 1781 invasion of Virginia, Jefferson escaped Richmond just ahead of the British forces, and the city was burned to the ground. In April of the same year, his daughter Lucy died at age 1. A second daughter of that name was born the following year, but she died at age 3. Member of Congress. The United States formed a Congress of the Confederation following victory in the Revolutionary War, and a peace treaty with Great Britain in 1783, to which Jefferson was appointed as a Virginia delegate. He was a member of the committee setting foreign exchange rates and recommended an American currency based on the decimal system, which was adopted in the Congress's 1783-84 session. Jefferson acted as chairman of committees to establish a viable system of government for the new republic and to propose a policy for the settlement of the Western territories. Jefferson was the principal author of the Land Ordinance of 1784, whereby Virginia ceded to the national government the vast area that it claimed northwest of the Ohio River. He insisted that this territory should not be used as colonial territory by any of the 13 states, but that it should be divided into sections which could become states. He plotted borders for 9 new states in their initial stages and wrote an ordinance banning slavery in all the nation's territories. Congress made extensive revisions, including rejection of the ban on slavery. Minister to France. Jefferson was sent by the Congress of the Confederation. Jefferson had Patsy educated at the Penmont Abbey. In 1786, he met and fell in love with Maria Cosway, an accomplished and married Italian-English musician of 27. They saw each other frequently over a period of 6 weeks. She returned to Great Britain, but they maintained a lifelong correspondence. Jefferson sent for his youngest surviving child, 9-year-old Polly, in June 1787. He brought some of his slaves, including James Hemings, whom he had trained in French cuisine, and his younger sister Sally Hemings. While in France, he became a regular companion of the Marquis de Lafayette, a French hero of the American Revolutionary War, and Jefferson used his influence to procure trade agreements with France. Secretary of State. Soon after returning from France, Jefferson accepted Washington's invitation to serve as Secretary of State. The second major issue was the capital's permanent location. Hamilton favored a capital close to the major commercial centers of the Northeast, while Washington, Jefferson, and other agrarians wanted it located to the south. In the spring of 1791, Jefferson and Congressman James Madison took a vacation to Vermont. Jefferson had been suffering from migraines and he was tired of Hamilton and fighting. Jefferson supported France against Britain when the two nations fought in 1793, though his arguments in the cabinet were undercut by French Revolutionary envoy Edmond Charles Janet's open scorn for President Washington. After the Washington administration negotiated the Jay Treaty with Great Britain, Jefferson saw a cause around which to rally his party and organized a national opposition from Monticello. Election of 1796 and Vice Presidency. In the presidential campaign of 1796, Jefferson lost the Electoral College vote to Federalist John Adams by 71-68 and was elected vice president because of a mistake in voting for Adams' running mate. As presiding officer of the Senate, he assumed a more passive role than his predecessor John Adams. He allowed the Senate to freely conduct debates and confined his participation to procedural issues, which he called an honorable and easy role. Jefferson held 4 confidential talks with French consul Joseph Latoum in the spring of 1797, where he attacked Adams' predicting that his rival would serve only one term. He also encouraged France to invade England, and advised Latombe to stall any American envoys sent to Paris by instructing him to listen to them and then drag out the negotiations at length and mollify them by the urbanity of the proceedings. Quote, during the Adams presidency, the Federalists rebuilt the military, levied new taxes, and enacted the Alien and Sedition Acts. Jefferson believed that these laws were intended to suppress Democratic Republicans, rather than prosecute enemy aliens, and considered them unconstitutional. Historian Ron Chernow claims that the theoretical damage of the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions was deep and lasting, and was a recipe for disunion, contributing to the American Civil War as well as later events. Jefferson and Madison moved to Philadelphia and founded the National Gazette in 1791, along with poet and writer Philip Freneau, in an effort to counter Hamilton's Federalist policies, which Hamilton was promoting through the influential Federalist newspaper the Gazette of the United States. The National Gazette made particular criticism of the policies promoted by Alexander Hamilton, often through anonymous essays signed by the pen name Brutus at Jefferson's urging, which were actually written by Madison. Jefferson had always admired Washington's leadership skills but felt that his Federalist Party was leading the country in the wrong direction. Jefferson thought it wise not to attend his funeral in 1799 because of acute differences with Washington while serving as Secretary of State, and remained at Monticello. Election of 1800. In the 1800 presidential election, Jefferson contended once more against Federalist John Adams. Adams' campaign was weakened by unpopular taxes and vicious Federalist infighting over his actions. In the quasi-war, Republicans ultimately won more Electoral College votes, but Jefferson and his vice presidential candidate Aaron Burr unexpectedly received an equal total. Due to the tie, the election was decided by the Federalist-dominated House of Representatives. The win was marked by Republican celebrations throughout the country. The transition proceeded smoothly, marking a watershed in American history. As historian Gordon S. Wood writes, it was one of the first popular elections in modern history that resulted in the peaceful transfer of power from one party to another. Quote, Presidency. Jefferson was sworn in by Chief Justice John Marshall at the new Capitol in Washington, D.C., on March 4, 1801. In contrast to his predecessors, Jefferson exhibited a dislike of formal etiquette. He arrived alone on horseback without escort, dressed plainly. Upon assuming office, he first confronted an $83 million national debt. Jefferson pardoned several of those imprisoned under the Alien and Sedition Acts. Jefferson strongly felt the need for a national military university, producing an officer engineering corps for a national defense based on the advancement of the sciences, rather than having to rely on foreign sources for top-grade engineers with questionable loyalty. First Barbary War. Barbary coast of North Africa 1806. Left as Morocco at Gibraltar. Center as Tunis, and right as Tripoli. American merchant ships had been protected from Barbary coast pirates by the Royal Navy when the states were British colonies. Pashas of Tripoli Yusuf Karamanli captured the USS Philadelphia, so Jefferson authorized William Eaton, the U.S. consul to Tunis, to lead a force to restore the Pasha's older brother to the throne. Louisiana Purchase. Spain ceded ownership of the Louisiana Territory in 1800 to the more predominant France. Jefferson was greatly concerned that Napoleon's broad interests in the vast territory would threaten the security of the continent and Mississippi River shipping. He wrote that the cession works most sorely on the U.S. It completely reverses all the political relations of the U.S. Quote, Napoleon realized that French military control was impractical over such a vast remote territory, and he was in dire need of funds for his wars on the home front. In early April 1803, he unexpectedly made negotiators a counter-offer to sell 827,987 square miles of French territory for $15 million, doubling the size of the United States. Most thought that this was an exceptional opportunity. Despite Republican reservations about the constitutional authority of the federal government to acquire land after the purchase, Jefferson preserved the region's Spanish legal code and instituted a gradual approach for integrating settlers into American democracy. He believed that a period of federal rule would be necessary while Louisianians adjusted to their new nation. Lewis and Clark Expedition. Jefferson anticipated further westward settlements due to the Louisiana Purchase and arranged for the exploration and mapping of the uncharted territory. He sought to establish a U.S. claim ahead of competing European interests and to find the rumored Northwest Passage. Jefferson appointed Meriwether, Lewis and William Clark to be leaders of the Corps of Discovery. The expedition lasted from May 1804 to September 1806. See timeline, and obtained a wealth of scientific and geographic knowledge, including knowledge of many Indian tribes. In addition to the Corps of Discovery, Jefferson organized 3 other Western expeditions: the William Dunbar and George Hunter expedition on the Washita River, the Thomas Freeman and Peter Custis expedition on the Red River, and the Zebulon Pike expedition into the Rocky Mountains and the Southwest. All 3 produced valuable information about the American frontier. American Indian policies. Jefferson's experiences with the American Indians began during his boyhood in Virginia and extended through his political career and into his retirement. He refuted the contemporary notion that Indians were an inferior people and maintained that they were equal in body and mind to people of European descent. As governor of Virginia during the Revolutionary War, Jefferson recommended moving the Cherokee and Shawnee tribes, who had allied with the British, to west of the Mississippi River. But when he took office as president, he quickly took measures to avert another major conflict. As American and Indian societies were in collision and the British were inciting Indian tribes from Canada, in keeping with his Enlightenment thinking, President Jefferson adopted an assimilation policy towards American Indians known as his Civilization Program, which included securing peaceful U.S. Indian treaty alliances and encouraging agriculture. Jefferson advocated that Indian tribes should make federal purchases by credit holding their lands as collateral for repayment. Various tribes accepted Jefferson's policies, including the Shawnees led by Black Hoof, the Creek, and the Cherokees. However, some Shawnees broke off from Black Hoof, led by Tecumseh, and opposed Jefferson's assimilation policies. Historian Bernard Sheehan argues that Jefferson believed that assimilation was best for American Indians. Second best was removal to the West. He felt that the worst outcome of the cultural and resources conflict between American citizens and American Indians would be their attacking the whites. Re-election in 1804 and second term. Jefferson's successful first term occasioned his renomination for president by the Republican Party, with George Clinton replacing Burr as his running mate. In March 1806, a split developed in the Republican Party, led by fellow Virginian and former Republican ally John Randolph, who viciously accused President Jefferson on the floor of the House of moving too far in the Federalist direction. In so doing, Randolph permanently set himself apart politically from Jefferson. Jefferson and Madison had backed resolutions to limit or ban British imports in retaliation for British actions against American shipping. Also, in 1808, Jefferson was the first president to propose a broad federal plan to build roads and canals across several states, asking for $20 million, further alarming Randolph and believers of limited government. Jefferson's popularity further suffered in his second term due to his response to wars in Europe. Positive relations with Great Britain had diminished, due partly to the antipathy between Jefferson and British diplomat Anthony Merry. After Napoleon's decisive victory at the Battle of Austerlitz in 1805, Napoleon became more aggressive in his negotiations over trading rights, which American efforts failed to counter. Jefferson then led the enactment of the Embargo Act of 1807, directed at both France and Great Britain. This triggered economic chaos in the U.S. and was strongly criticized at the time, resulting in Jefferson having to abandon the policy a year later. During the Revolutionary era, the states abolished the international slave trade, but South Carolina reopened it. In his annual message of December 1806, Jefferson denounced the violations of human rights attending the international slave trade, calling on the newly elected Congress to criminalize it immediately. In 1807, Congress passed the act prohibiting importation of slaves, which Jefferson signed. In the wake of the Louisiana Purchase, Jefferson sought to annex Florida from Spain, as brokered by Napoleon. Burr conspiracy and trial. Following the 1801 electoral deadlock, Jefferson's relationship rapidly eroded with his vice president, former New York Senator Aaron Burr. Jefferson suspected Burr of seeking the presidency for himself, while Burr was angered by Jefferson's refusal to appoint some of his supporters to federal office. Burr was dropped from the Republican ticket in 1804. The same year, Burr was soundly defeated in his bid to be elected New York governor. During the campaign, Alexander Hamilton publicly made callous remarks regarding Burr's moral character. After leaving office in April 1805, Burr traveled west and conspired with Louisiana Territory Governor James Wilkinson, beginning a large-scale recruitment for a military expedition. In the fall of 1806, Burr launched a military flotilla carrying about 60 men down the Ohio River. Wilkinson renounced the plot, apparently from self-interested motives. He reported Burr's expedition to Jefferson, who immediately ordered Burr's arrest. Burr's 1807 conspiracy trial became a national issue. Chesapeake Leopard Affair and Embargo Act. The British conducted raids on American shipping and kidnapped seamen in 1806-07. Thousands of Americans were thus impressed into the British naval service. In 1806, Jefferson issued a call for a boycott of British goods. On April 18, Congress passed the Non-Importation Acts, but they were never enforced. Later that year, Jefferson asked James Monroe and William Pinckney to negotiate with Great Britain to end the harassment of American shipping, though Britain showed no signs of improving relations. The Monroe-Pinckney Treaty was finalized but lacked any provisions to end impressment, and Jefferson refused to submit it to the Senate for ratification. The British ship HMS Leopard fired upon the USS Chesapeake off the Virginia coast in June 1807, and Jefferson prepared for war. In December, news arrived that Napoleon had extended the Berlin Decree, globally banning British imports. In Britain, King George III ordered redoubling efforts at impressment, including American sailors, but the war fever of the summer faded. Congress had no appetite to prepare the U.S. for war. Jefferson asked for and received the Embargo Act, an alternative that allowed the U.S. more time to build up defensive works, militias, and naval forces. Later historians have seen irony in Jefferson's assertion of such federal power. Meacham claims that the Embargo Act was a projection of power which surpassed the Alien and Sedition Acts. And R. B. Bernstein writes that Jefferson was pursuing policies resembling those he had cited in 1776 as grounds for independence and revolution. Secretary of State James Madison supported the embargo with equal vigor to Jefferson. Most historians consider Jefferson's embargo to have been ineffective and harmful to American interests. In December 1807, Jefferson announced his intention not to seek a third term. He turned his attention increasingly to Monticello during the last year of his presidency, giving Madison and Gallatin almost total control of affairs. Retirement and later years. Following his retirement from the presidency, Jefferson continued his pursuit of educational interests. He sold his vast collection of books to the Library of Congress, and founded and built the University of Virginia. University of Virginia. Jefferson envisioned a university free of church influences where students could specialize in many new areas not offered at other colleges. He believed that education engendered a stable society, which should provide publicly funded schools accessible to students from all social strata, based solely on ability. Jefferson was a strong disciple of Greek and Roman architectural styles, which he believed to be most representative of American democracy. Each academic unit, called a pavilion, was designed with a two-story temple front, while the library rotunda was modeled on the Roman Pantheon. Jefferson referred to the university's grounds as the academical village, and he reflected his educational ideas in its layout. The 10 pavilions included classrooms and faculty residences. They formed a quadrangle and were connected by colonnades, behind which stood the students' rows of rooms. Gardens and vegetable plots were placed behind the pavilions and were surrounded by serpentine walls, affirming the importance of the agrarian lifestyle. When Jefferson died in 1826, James Madison replaced him as rector. Reconciliation with Adams. Jefferson and John Adams had been good friends in the first decades of their political careers, serving together in the Continental Congress in the 1770s and in Europe in the 1780s. The Federalist, Republican split of the 1790s divided them, however, and Adams felt betrayed by Jefferson's sponsorship of partisan attacks, such as those of James Callender. Jefferson, on the other hand, was angered at Adams for his appointment of midnight judges. As early as 1809, Benjamin Rush, signer of the Declaration of Independence, desired that Jefferson and Adams reconcile and began to prod the two through correspondence to re-establish contact. Autobiography. In 1821, at the age of 77, Jefferson began writing his autobiography, in order to state some recollections of dates and facts concerning myself. Quote, he also expressed opposition to the idea of a privileged aristocracy made up of large land-owning families partial to the king, and instead promoted the aristocracy of virtue and talent, which nature has wisely provided for the direction of the interests of society, and scattered with equal hand through all its conditions, was deemed essential to a well-ordered republic. Quote, Jefferson gave his insight about people, politics, and events. Lafayette's visit. In the summer of 1824, the Marquis de Lafayette accepted an invitation from President James Monroe to visit the country. Jefferson and Lafayette had not seen each other since 1789. After visits to New York, New England, and Washington, Lafayette arrived at Monticello on November 4. Jefferson's grandson Randolph was present and recorded the reunion. As they approached each other, their uncertain gait quickened itself into a shuffling run, and exclaiming, "Ah, Jefferson! Ah, Lafayette!" Single quote. They burst into tears as they fell into each other's arms. Jefferson and Lafayette then retired to the house to reminisce. Final days, death, and burial. Jefferson's approximately $100,000 of debt weighed heavily on his mind in his final months, as it became increasingly clear that he would have little to leave to his heirs. In February 1826, he successfully applied to the General Assembly to hold a public lottery as a fundraiser. During the last hours of his life, he was accompanied by family members and friends. On July 4 at 12:50 p.m., Jefferson died at age 83 on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, and just a few hours before the death of John Adams. Shortly after Jefferson had died, attendants found a gold locket on a chain around his neck, where it had rested for more than 40 years, containing a small faded blue ribbon which tied a lock of his wife Martha's brown hair. Here was buried Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of American Independence, of the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom, and father of the University of Virginia. Jefferson died deeply in debt, unable to pass on his estate freely to his heirs. Political, social, and religious views. Jefferson subscribed to the political ideals expounded by John Locke, Francis Bacon, and Isaac Newton, whom he considered the three greatest men that ever lived. Society and government. According to Jefferson's philosophy, citizens have certain inalienable rights, and rightful liberty is unobstructed action according to our will, within limits drawn around us by the equal rights of others. Quote, he was convinced that individual liberties were the fruit of political equality, which were threatened by arbitrary government. Jefferson was steeped in the British Whig tradition of the oppressed majority set against a repeatedly unresponsive court party in the Parliament. He justified small outbreaks of rebellion as necessary to get monarchical regimes to amend oppressive measures compromising popular liberties. In a Republican regime ruled by the majority, he acknowledged it will often be exercised when wrong. Democracy. Jefferson considered democracy to be the expression of society, and promoted national self-determination, cultural uniformity, and education of all males of the Commonwealth. After resigning as Secretary of State in 1795, Jefferson focused on the electoral bases of the Republicans and Federalists. The Republican classification for which he advocated included the entire body of landholders everywhere and the body of laborers without land. Beginning with Jefferson's electioneering for the Revolution of 1800, his political efforts were based on egalitarian appeals. At the onset of the Revolution, Jefferson accepted William Blackstone's argument that property ownership would sufficiently empower voters' independent judgment, but he sought to further expand suffrage by land distribution to the poor. Religion. Jefferson's Bible, featuring only the words of Jesus from the evangelists, in parallel Greek, Latin, French and English. Baptized in his youth, Jefferson became a governing member of his local Episcopal church in Charlottesville, which he later attended with his daughters. Jefferson was firmly anti-clerical, writing in Every Age, "The priest has been hostile to liberty. They have perverted the purest religion ever preached to man into mystery and jargon." The phrase, "separation of church and state," has been cited several times by the Supreme Court in its interpretation of the Establishment Clause. Jefferson donated to the American Bible Society, saying the four evangelists delivered a pure and sublime system of morality to humanity. He thought Americans would rationally create a Pierian religion, extracting the best traditions of every denomination. Jefferson's unorthodox religious beliefs became an important issue in the 1800 presidential election. Banks. Jefferson distrusted government banks and opposed public borrowing, which he thought created long-term debt, bred monopolies, and invited dangerous speculation as opposed to productive labor. In 1791, President Washington asked Jefferson, then Secretary of State, and Hamilton, the Secretary of the Treasury. If the Congress had the authority to create a national bank, while Hamilton believed Congress had the authority, Jefferson and Madison thought a national bank would ignore the needs of individuals and farmers, and would violate the 10th Amendment by assuming powers not granted to the federal government by the states. Jefferson used agrarian resistance to banks and speculators as the first defining principle of an opposition party, recruiting candidates for Congress on the issue as early as 1792. Slavery. Jefferson lived in a planter economy largely dependent upon slavery, and as a wealthy landholder, used slave labor for his household, plantation, and workshops. He first recorded his slaveholding in 1774, when he counted 41. Jefferson once said, "My first wish is that the laborers may be well treated." Jefferson felt slavery was harmful to both slave and master, but had reservations about releasing unprepared slaves into freedom and advocated gradual emancipation. Jefferson shared the common belief of his day that blacks were mentally and physically inferior, but argued they nonetheless had innate human rights. During his presidency, Jefferson was for the most part publicly silent on the issue of slavery and emancipation. Historical assessment. Scholars remain divided on whether Jefferson truly condemned slavery and how he changed. Jefferson-Hemings controversy. Claims that Jefferson fathered Sally Hemings' children have been debated since 1802. That year James T. Callender, after being denied a position as postmaster, alleged Jefferson had taken Hemings as a concubine and fathered several children with her. Interests and activities. Jefferson was a farmer, obsessed with new crops, soil conditions, garden designs, and scientific agricultural techniques. His main cash crop was tobacco, but its price was usually low and it was rarely profitable. He tried to achieve self-sufficiency with wheat, vegetables, flax, corn, hogs, sheep, poultry, and cattle to supply his family, slaves, and employees, but he had cash flow problems and was always in debt. In the field of architecture, Jefferson helped popularize the Neo-Palladian style in the United States, utilizing designs for the Virginia State Capitol, the University of Virginia, Monticello, and others. He was interested in birds and wine, and was a noted gourmet. He was also a prolific writer and linguist, and spoke several languages. American Philosophical Society. Jefferson was a member of the American Philosophical Society for 35 years. Beginning in 1780, through the society he advanced the sciences and Enlightenment ideals, emphasizing that knowledge of science reinforced and extended freedom. Jefferson served as APS president for the next 18 years, including through both terms of his presidency. Linguistics. Jefferson had a lifelong interest in linguistics, could speak, read and write in a number of languages, including French, Greek, Italian, and German. In his early years he excelled in classical language while at boarding school. Jefferson claimed to have taught himself Spanish during his 19-day journey to France, using only a grammar guide and a copy of Don Quixote. Jefferson was not an outstanding orator and preferred to communicate through writing or remain silent if possible, instead of delivering his State of the Union addresses himself. Jefferson wrote the annual messages and sent a representative to read them aloud in Congress. This started a tradition which continued until 1913, when President Woodrow Wilson chose to deliver his own State of the Union address. Inventions. Jefferson invented many small practical devices and improved contemporary inventions, including a revolving book stand and a great clock powered by the gravitational pull on cannonballs. He improved the pedometer, the polygraph, a device for duplicating writing, As minister to France, Jefferson was impressed by the military standardization program known as the Système Agricole, and initiated a program as president to develop interchangeable parts for firearms. For his inventiveness and ingenuity, he received several honorary Doctor of Law degrees. Historical reputation. Jefferson is an icon of individual liberty, democracy, and republicanism, hailed as the author of the Declaration of Independence, an architect of the American Revolution, and a Renaissance man who promoted science and scholarship. Jefferson's reputation declined during the Civil War due to his support of states' rights. In the late 19th century, his legacy was widely criticized. Conservatives felt his democratic philosophy had led to that era's populist movement, while progressives sought a more activist federal government than Jefferson's philosophy allowed. Both groups saw Hamilton as vindicated by history, rather than Jefferson, and President Woodrow Wilson even described Jefferson as, though a great man, not a great American. In the 1930s, Jefferson was held in higher esteem. President Franklin D. Roosevelt and New Deal Democrats celebrated his struggles for the common man and reclaimed him as their party's founder. Jefferson became a symbol of American democracy in the incipient Cold War, and the 1940s and 50s saw the zenith of his popular reputation. Noting the huge output of scholarly books on Jefferson in recent years, historian Gordon Wood summarizes the raging debates about Jefferson's stature. Although many historians and others are embarrassed about his contradictions and have sought to knock him off the Democratic pedestal, his position, though shaky, still seems secure. Quote, the Siena Research Institute poll of presidential scholars, begun in 1982, has consistently ranked Jefferson as one of the 5 best U.S. presidents. Memorials and honors. Jefferson has been memorialized with buildings, sculptures, postage, and currency. In the 1920s, Jefferson, together with George Washington, Theodore Roosevelt, and Abraham Lincoln, was chosen by sculptor Gutzon Borglum and approved by President Calvin Coolidge to be depicted in stone at the Mount Rushmore Memorial. The Jefferson Memorial was dedicated in Washington, D.C. in 1943, on the 200th anniversary of Jefferson's birth. The interior of the memorial includes a 19-foot statue of Jefferson and engravings of passages from his writings. Most prominent are the words inscribed around the monument near the roof. I have sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man. Quote, writings. Memorandums taken on a journey from Paris into the southern parts of France and northern Italy in the year 1787. Plan for establishing uniformity in the coinage, weights, and measures of the United States. A report submitted to Congress. An essay towards facilitating instruction in the Anglo-Saxon and modern dialects of the English language.